I feel like what we need on this table, though, is the little dish of cookies and then the samovar.
Then we have
and then we have a real conversation over tea. But we'll try nonetheless. So, of course, Ignat, with that introduction, it's clear. And in fact, if you go on YouTube, these exist. You could do a program all to yourself, your own work and your accomplishments. But tonight we're going to talk about your father. This is the 100th anniversary of his birth, which is actually next month. And 20 years after first being published in Russian, this is the first time that we're seeing Between Two Millstones in the English language. So let me start, though, with the full name of the work. It's actually The Little Grain Caught Between Two Millstones. It's clear your father was, in that title, The Little Grain, and considered that the two millstones were, one, the Soviet Union and its decades-long campaign of censorship and repression against him, but the other millstone was the West. Tell us a little bit about that other millstone in your father's understanding.
Well, of course, this work is a successor to what is known in English by the somewhat inscrutable title of The Oak and the Calf. The Oak and the Calf doesn't have any associations in English that I'm aware of, other than it's the memoir of his Soviet years, of his first Russian years, by Solzhenitsyn. The reason it has such a strange name is because it's very difficult to translate these Russian proverbs into English. So the full "Бодался теленок с дубом" would be translated literally as the oak, the calf butted against the oak, and it's difficult to translate it that way. But the point is that was his battle against the monolith of the Soviet state, the young, inexperienced, weak little calf going up against this Soviet oak. And so this idea of using proverbs that are sprinkled throughout his works is indeed here, as you say, in the title of Zernishka, of Little Grain Caught Between Two Millstones. So yes, this idea of in our post-industrial age, many people may hardly remember what millstones look like and how they function, right? But
the whole 1970s typesetting technology,
right? But they grind against each other, and they grind to destroy what they're grinding and to produce flour and whatever the case may be. So yes, this little grain is caught, as you say, between, of course, the Soviet machine on the one hand, and yes, the West, not the West per se, but the leading circles of the opinion, as they are called now, the opinion makers of the West, the decision makers, those of whom, of course, amongst whom the media play a large role still today in the age of Twitter and internet and so forth. And so taken together, this class of opinion makers that was hostile and perhaps remains largely hostile, I guess the future will tell, to any idea of a free, resurgent, even just healthy Russia. Mm-hmm. And so, although the little grain in the Russian title, which is omitted for some of the reasons I just mentioned, in the English title, just Between Two Millstones, but yes, the little grain, of course, is Solzhenitsyn himself, who is just one speck, one human caught in. But it also refers, the major themes of the book refer, of course, to Russia, the historical Russia, the Russia as a nation, being caught between its communist overlords, mm-hmm. who are, of course, themselves Russian, and that's obviously also the case. But and a West that does not that has no particular interest. Broadly speaking, I'm taking the liberty to generalize, of course, to see Russia strong, prosperous, or equal, not in a superpower way, but just as a strong, vibrant country might be. So those are the themes that he dealt with already in the 1970s, and that have obviously extraordinary relevance today.
So in 1978, he gives this, I think, instantly, famously controversial commencement address at Harvard, In recounting the controversy, it's actually amazing to me what close attention he paid to the public response. I mean, he's quoting in the book, letters to the editor being written into newspapers and people's reactions and so on. It's not just the kind of big ticket reactions. But he says this, he decries the arrogant stance of the America of New York and Washington, presumably in response to the messages of the speech, but said, gradually another America began unfolding before my eyes, one that was small town and robust, the Heartland, the America I had envisioned as I was writing my speech and to which my speech was addressed. What a very American sentiment, and also what a very current sentiment in many ways. It seems to convey a real affection of some kind for this American heartland. Was this, in fact, your father's America? I mean, did he have an idealized version of America in your experience with him?
I don't think he had an idealized version of America. I think he saw. He would never presume to say that he would speak of America with authority or even with great knowledge, because most of his experience in America was spent writing, researching about a different country in a different time, about the Red Wheel that we've been speaking about, the Russian Revolution. But why did he settle in America, incidentally? I hope this doesn't offend too many of our friends across the northern border, but he was planning to settle in Canada, but was not very impressed with Canada at the time. From such impressions as any of us might make from a couple of weeks of travel, and his impressions were not so great. On the other hand, as any proper civilized European, he was not expecting to like America, uncivilized, unread, uncouth, unsophisticated, and found quite the opposite to be the case. In his brief impressions, and found America to be, even at that time of 70s malaise, as it's inevitably called now, or referred to now, a country that was dynamic, powerful, contradictory, to be sure, but a place that made sense for him to call home, so long as he found himself exiled in the West. With respect to the Heartland, and you said he paid close attention. What he usually did was, he was a very efficient person, and he was always in a race against the clock to finish the Red Wheel, the great work of his life, and race against the clock because witnesses were dying, because records were disappearing, because his own time on Earth was obviously limited, and one never knows how much one has to live. But so he would usually ignore what was being said about him or written about him, until some occasion arose that he needed to find out. And so with Harvard, it actually happened fairly soon, but there was such an avalanche of responses that in a few months later, he sat down and said, okay, I'm going to have to put my work aside. And he just systematically read everything that was being sent to him. So he wasn't certainly researching anything, but people would send not only all the editorials of New York Times, Washington Post, but different provincial, can we say that, newspapers, and letters to the editor, as you say, and different responses. So in short, he found much in America that he found disappointing or troubling, and he speaks of that in the Harvard address, may I remind you, as a friend of the West. Right. And he says, I wouldn't dare say this except that I speak as your friend. And in another place he says, I say this not as an enemy of the West. Some of his criticisms about, well, you can reread maybe the speech. It very much bears rereading today. But he says, I don't speak as an enemy of the West, I speak as an enemy of the weakness of the West. And of course, that was a time when the communist dominoes were falling at almost warp speed. And Greece, Portugal, I mean, those countries didn't, but just about, if you remember, or if you've read it for the younger folks in the history books, Greece, Portugal, Spain, Vietnam, Angola, Nicaragua, El Salvador, one after another, and it really was, that process was accelerating. So he's coming from knowing that regime very well and knowing that communism would never stop unless met by force, which is exactly what happened eventually. He felt his duty to warn against what he saw as a frightening process.
Now, in his time in his American exile, a great many Americans, and indeed others, Europeans and certainly Russians, other Russians in exile, sought to enlist him in what you would call political causes. So not just the great struggle and sort of the intellectual and moral questions, but, can you help me get this done? And he was reluctant. How did he think about that?
That's a great question. There were a couple of aspects. First of all, it's exactly what you said, Matt. He was concerned as a historian, as an author, as a philosopher, with the great timeless questions of course, of our human condition, and really the existential questions that specifically for the West at that time, as a little bit we refer to, but really the existential questions for humanity. Much of the Harvard address is about that. Is about, okay, East and West have such divergent paths, but where are we going? Are we not heading down the same kind of rabbit hole now? So that's the first reason, is that he always felt unimpressed by the political process and by what it brings out in people and what it brings out in nations. He was particularly unimpressed with parties. And he thought that political parties, by definition, would crassen and coarsen the debate in any country at any time. And so
Just remember that line when you go home and watch the news tonight.
that's right. Yes, I suspect that's one thing that's all the networks to which we're referred will agree on, is that nothing's more important than this party, that party, and the parties. But he really did not agree with that. And incidentally, that's one way in which he did not feel that Russia should ape or automatically copy the West, despite the extraordinary traditions of Western thought about, particularly with regard to civic and civil liberties, particularly with regard to the importance of the individual in front of the law. But despite that, he said, let's not copy everything. Some things aren't maybe as wise, or maybe just don't apply to Russia or another country in the same way that they might here. And so the other reason you mentioned why he didn't delve into kind of every cause that came around the corner was one, the magnitude of it, and two, is he valued greatly his independence. His independence, I think, not in some kind of a official way, but his independence in the kind of when he would look in the mirror. I think to be able to say that he answers to no one but a higher calling and his art and the truth as best he could divine it or see it. So to get kind of bogged down in, and I'm sure he writes about it in this book, and in The Oak and the Calf, and in book 2 of this, which is coming next year, that he writes about certain causes that he would have liked to support for sure. So it's not that he's not interested, or very noble causes perhaps, but ones that simply he does not have the energy for, and doesn't. Well, if you support this, then shouldn't you also support this, and also support? But he wanted to be able to kind of observe and to think more globally.
So, surely every parent, and I say this as a parent of 3 as well, wrestles with, how to divide attention between the great challenges or the small challenges of the day and the small charges over whose lives one has responsibility and authority. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn was your father. And when did you, growing up in Vermont, realize that you had to share him with the world?
It's funny, that question. I've seen and heard my brothers were mentioned tonight, being interviewed or writing about different things, and this question comes up. And for some reason, my younger brothers, and maybe that has something to do with it, Stepan, often says that it took him a long time, or it was a gradual process, and so for him to realize the scope and who Solzhenitsyn, who his father, Papa, who he was. For me, I remember it quite differently. We had the same childhood, and that I guess shows you people are different. For me, as long as I can remember my father, I remember some sense. I don't remember knowing him as just a regular dad and not being. I always remember being aware that he's somebody who's in great demand. Somebody who's think about the physical, the kind of the routine of daily life where. Well-wishers and autograph seekers and
you knew
ill-wishers.
You knew that wasn't
well, they were
normal
there. They were
for
knocking on our door in Zurich.
Yeah.
And constantly come to visit Herr Professor Solzhenitsyn for a few minutes and plan to save the world or to tell him everything he did wrong and wrote incorrectly in his books or whatever the case, to hatch a plan of salvation or to hatch a plan to, whatever. All kinds. And then journalists, press folks all the time, give an interview here, give an interview there, TV, radio, So that constantly accompanied our childhood, even eventually in remote Vermont. So for me, I always remember that, I do.
So what about the work in your childhood? There he is, I picture him kind of in this temple of nature. My wife is from Vermont, so we also spend time in Vermont's beautiful woods. But this is his principal pursuit, is writing, right? Is doing the reading, the writing, the research, and he enlists you and your brothers and your mother in that project. What is that like for you as a child?
Well, it was very exciting, and I think one felt a great sense of importance to be allowed to participate. I think children in general,
right,
if they're allowed to participate in an adult activity, even if it's just to stay up late for a fancy dinner, or to be allowed, or that first taste of wine, or whatever might be, or something, or watching some kind of a vaguely scandalous film to get, one feels different as a child. And I think partly it was just that kind of thing. On the one hand, we knew how important, we had a sense, I don't mean to say that we were expert children in some way, but we had a sense. Mm-hmm. And we knew why his work was important in a broad, in the same way that I know it today. Mm-hmm. It was important for Russia, that it was important for historical memory. This we could understand, I think, from an early age. And so we were, and we were recruited by my father and my mother, who was his indispensable colleague in really in all his work except the actual writing, because there was nobody else, right, and because we were pretty well educated. Right. And we were educated well because of their efforts, and they, right, it was very exciting.
Research assistants? I don't need research assistants. I have kids.
But it was difficult to find them, and
I'll have to try that.
It was difficult to find them in Vermont.
So
that was the drawback of moving to a place that was not Greenwich Village.
So he enlists you in the project of writing with a higher purpose, which is very much about Russia. And yet, you're not in Russia. You are spending your childhood in America. Tell us the story of the rock on the property, the horse rock.
Yes, there's a famous photograph of Solzhenitsyn with his 3 young boys. I'm the middle of 3, and sitting on this large rock. I mean, it's not huge, but it's big enough that 4 people can sit on it, astride this rock. All facing there, and Solzhenitsyn is pointing into the distance, and that was not posed, as far as I know. And he hated photographs, and he especially hated posing for photographs. And so I think it was what do they call candid shots? But it's one of those great shots. And what it was about was this large boulder on our property in Vermont, which my father described as a magic horse, a horse upon which an evil spell had been cast, contemporaneous with the enslavement of Russia under the communist Bolshevik yoke. And he told us, we were very young, mind you, that when the time came, which he always believed would come, and it did come, that Russia would cast off this yoke, that Russia would become free. Then in that day, this horse would also cast off its spell, and like Pegasus, fly us home.
So this line just jumped off the page to me. When I return home to Russia one day, I'm certain that everything will fall back into place, everything that didn't make sense to him, everything that upset him. It is for that moment that I live and write. In fact, that happened. There was a moment where he returned. It was, as far as I know, not on board a magic horse, but it was a way that he forecast in the memoir. He said he would go by train across as much of the country as he could from the east, and not via Moscow, because he never felt himself to be a Muscovite.
Absolutely true, and actually this harkens back to that earlier point you made about Heartland America or regular America, which for him, part of that was that he was not a city boy. Mm-hmm. My mother was a Muscovite. She loves Moscow to this day, lives in Moscow, of course, again now. But my father was from the south. He was from a small town, and in general didn't particularly like big cities, and loved central, kind of nameless Russia, the flyover Russia, shall we say. So for him, that connection, I think, with Heartland America was important. Getting back to this point, he conceived of that idea to come back in an unorthodox way and not kind of paying obeisance and homage to the great political and, for what it's worth, economic center of the empire. Moscow, he said, no, I want to come back another way. And so also he selfishly, if you will, wanted to have a chance to see Russia from as a free man and not aboard a prison train. Not from the those slits, if they were lucky, in those cattle cars in which he and his fellow prisoners were transported freely across the Siberian plains, southern Siberia and Kazakhstan and everywhere else. So he wanted to have a chance finally to see some of these places and to get a sense, after coming back from 18 years in exile, from 20 years in exile, to see what was going on at a time. This is 1994, of course, at a time of wrenching change, and still a time of great possibility, but that was slipping away very quickly.
That's right. So your father gets back in the tumult of the 1990s, and Putin ascends to the presidency, and he actually meets Putin towards the end of his life.
Obviously, that's a little later.
Maybe a little bit later.
Like 7 years later, but right.
Here we are now.
But 20, now many more years still have passed.
20 years into the Putin era. Did he in that early day, did he share any impressions of this man who would lead Russia for 20 years?
No, I don't remember discussing it with him. They did meet once. It wasn't a very long meeting. I don't think it was terribly substantive. Or at least it doesn't appear to have had very substantive results. Let's say that. But for my father, he was asked. Of course, he was asked so much in those days. Gorbachev. What do you think about him with this? What do you think about that? What do you think about this? What do you think about that? Then Yeltsin. What do you think about him? Is Yeltsin good? Is Yeltsin bad? Is Gorbachev good? Is he bad? Is Putin good? Is Putin bad? And again, that he always thought that's not the right way to be looking at it. Certainly as a historian, and certainly as a man who held the fate of Russia, shall we say, always in front of his eyes, in front of his mind's eye, I should say, what it could be, and what it has been, and what it could be, and what are the dangers, and what are the pitfalls, and what are the hopes for Russia in the Soviet time. Very different set of circumstances than in the new Russia after the Soviet time, and so I think he would agree, and in other words, if he would agree with a certain policy that he thought would further the 2 or 3 central aims as he saw them that Russian government should support, then he would like that, and to the extent that any of those leaders, not to mention the Soviet leaders before that would go against or directly hurt Russia as opposed to, he would of course be against that.
Well, and this is in a sense what you said about his return, which is his love of Russia didn't flow through Moscow and the Kremlin. It flowed through another Russia, through the Heartland. And maybe arguably, his appreciation for America also flowed through something different than Washington, New York, politics.
Definitely.
If your father could speak today about the Russia and the America of today and the relationship, what has happened between these two, what do you think he would say about this?
Well, I wouldn't presume to say what he would say, but I know what he did say. What he wished. First of all, he would not really presume to generally speaking, to advise or pontificate about America or any other country. I mean, America maybe just a little more because he did spend 18 years here.
He did some pontificating about America.
Harvard was his one silver bullet, if you will, was his one chance. By the way, in case anybody's curious, it's described here in the book. He did not seek a platform actually never in his life did he seek a public platform other than, of course, through his pen, through his books. But he never sought to speak at Harvard. He never imagined why would, he would speak at Harvard. All his famous speeches in New York and Washington were by invitation. And Harvard, and he described it here, he said in the winter of 1978, I can find you the passage, entirely unexpectedly an invitation came from Harvard, right? I mean, I think I just more or less quoted it. So okay, actually I'm not traveling that much.
Unexpectedly, I think because he had declined an invitation already.
Yes, I think he had declined, and he had declined so many, and everybody knew that he was declining them. And mostly because he would say, thank you so much for the honor, but I don't have time to travel to Oxford or to Bologna or to Sorbonne or to anywhere to meet all kinds of dignitaries. And he always assumed it couldn't be, and usually it was true that it couldn't be done without somebody bothering to show up and accept the honor. And so he was declining one after another. Harvard, he felt at that time, you know what, it's not that far. From Vermont, and he was ready to give it a shot, to give his. But that obviously, as you say, made waves that resounded for decades and probably continue today. But it wasn't. But that really was his one time. As far as Russia, he spoke. I think his views about Russia are very clear. They flow from the decades of his writings, not just his novels, but his publicistic works, and where he seeks to identify the multitude of ills that plague Russia, self-inflicted, 99% of them, for sure, and then what to do about them. And his general diagnosis, I think, would be still true today. That in some ways doesn't change that much from the imperial times. There's a wonderful little book called Russian Question at the End of the 20th Century, which is written in 1994, the year he goes back to 93, 94, goes back to Russia. And it's a little survey, an extremely depressing survey, but it's short, so you don't have to be depressed for long, about the missed opportunities of Russian history. And basically he looks back at really the Romanovs, so 400 years, not so much before that. And he says, look, one czar after another, instead of focusing on what he calls internal development, on focusing on what today I think is called human capital, the Human Development Index, more important now than what am I thinking? Gross domestic product GDP, instead of GDP now. It's the whatever Bhutan is leading the world in, right? So
gross national happiness.
National happiness and all these things that we can't quite put a finger on. But he said, look, we have to focus on our people on their health, on their well-being, on their just freedom, their right not to be dead at 45. Right. From absolute malnutrition or from alcoholism and all these other things. So to preserve the people, to turn away from empire. And so he did not find too much to admire in these imperial ambitions of the Romanovs. He said, why are we fighting wars, 8 wars with Turkey from between 1789 80s and the World War I. Why are we fighting all these wars of Turkey? Why do we need to dominate the Dardanelles? Right. And then we need access to that strait. For what? Why don't we help our own people? And so that remains true today. The idea of local grassroots democracy, and in general, stop waiting for, you hear that in America. I've been hearing that in this country my whole life. Washington, D.C. I think that's where we are now. But Washington, don't let Washington make all the decisions, right. Local right. decisions. Right. And he very much felt that in Russia, that there was that tradition of just wait for the Tsar, right. or in the Soviet times, right. much more so. Right. He wanted people to stand up and say, you know what, why don't we do something? Our school is no good, our roof leaks, whatever. Yeah. Let's do something about it.
Fascinating figure. So, last question, Ignat. It is the centennial. A fitting moment to ask, for you personally, what is your best memory of your father?
Wonderful memories, many, many wonderful memories. I don't know to name one. I know that spending time with, it's interesting, people assume that he was a kind of a remote, austere figure, and he really was not. He was a very busy man who was profoundly devoted to his work, to his art. And again, with always that sense of the ticking clock, of the race against time. So he did not spend the quantity of time with us that certainly that the modern father probably that you maybe do, and that I try to do with my children. But what he may have lacked in quantity, he certainly made up in quality. And so this is just to say that the time that we spent with him, which was an hour and a half a day with him, beyond family meals or dinner, and so would be time that he would teach us swimming, would be time that he would teach us mathematics, astronomy, physics, Russian history, church history, other subjects I'm not thinking of. And he would read to us, and he was a great teacher and a man of tremendous charisma. And so those were, I think, some of my happiest memories of a childhood from the beginning until I left home at 14, was just spending time with him, learning and looking at the summer nighttime sky and learning the constellations, and just his love for knowledge and his sharing it. I think just in toto, in sum, those are great memories.
Well, Ignat, thank you for sharing this time with us.